Erev Tov and good evening, everyone. We're in the Zera Shimshon on Parsha Devarim, starting sefer Devarim, and we are in Os Daled, section 4, in the sefer itself. That is Daf Reish Pei Daled. So the Zera Shimshon is going to comment on a couple of psukim that we're going to look at right now, and a Rashi on one of those psukim. We are in Parak Aleph of sefer Devarim, and the psukim that we're going to read are Chaf Beis and Chaf Gimel. So starting with Pasuk Chav Beis, Vatikruvun Elai Kulchem. Moshe is recounting what happened with to Bnei Yisrael. He's recounting to them what happened with the incident of the Meraglim. So he says, Vatikruvun Elai Kulchem. All of you approached me. Vatomru, and you said, Nishlecha Anoshim Lefanenu. Let us send men in front of us. Vayachperu Lanu Es Haaretz, and let them search out the land. V'yoshivu osonu davar, and they will bring back to us word. They'll bring back a report. As haderech asher na'aleh, the path that we should go up. Ve'es ha'arim asher navo alehen, and the cities that we should come into them. So they'll come back and they'll give us a plan as to how best to conquer the land or how best to enter the land. Pasuk Chav Gimel. Vayitav be'enai hadavar. And this thing was good in my eyes. This request that Bnei Yisrael made was good in my eyes. Moshe says, and I took from amongst you 12 men, ish echad lashavet, one man from each tribe. So those are the two psukim. And now let's take a look at a Rashi. Rashi on Pasuk Chav Gimel, where Moshe says, Vayitav be'enai hadavar. And this was good in my eyes. This request was good in my eyes. So Rashi says, Be'enai v'lo be'enei hamakom. It was good in my eyes, Moshe said, but it was not good in Hashem's eyes. Ve'im be'enei Moshe hayatov lama amara b'sochachos. So Rashi asks, if Moshe is conceding that this request to send spies made sense to him, it was a good idea in his mind to do so. Why is he mentioning it now in a form that is critical, that is a reproof, a tochacha to Bnei Yisrael? As a matter of fact, if we go further in the psukim past what we read, the incident of the Meraglim is recounted in a very brief form. It's summarized. But Moshe even says, because of you, I wasn't allowed. Because of this whole incident of the Meraglim, I wasn't allowed to go into Eretz Yisrael, which of course raises its own questions as to whether or not that is part of the reason that Moshe wasn't allowed to go in. But he says that. But certainly he is rebuking Bnei Yisrael and the very least in a subtle way here. And so Rashi says, well, if Moshe said he thought it was a good idea, why is he saying this in any way critical of Bnei Yisrael? So Rashi answers, Mashal la'adam she'omer lechavero. This is similar to a man who says to his friend, Mechor li chamor chazeh. One guy says to another guy, sell me your donkey, sell me your chamor. Omar lo hein. So the seller says, yeah, okay. Nosno atalila nisayon. So the prospective buyer says, will you give it to me to try out? Will you let me check it out first and have a test drive with the chamor? Amar lo hein. The seller says, yeah, I'll do that, no problem. Beharimu gavos, can I take it both into the mountains and in the hills? Can I take it around in some tough terrain? Amar lo hein. The seller says, yes, you can do that. Kivon shara she'ein ma'akvo klum. Since the prospective buyer sees that the seller isn't worried about anything and he's not holding back anything, alokech belibo, the purchaser will say in his heart, batuach uzeh shelo emtza bo mum. This seller is positive that I can take it around and use it and test drive it in mountains and hills and other places, and I'm not going to find any problem. Miyad omar lo, immediately the buyer says, tol ma'osecha. Take your money, take the money. I don't need to check it out. I don't need to try it out. I can see how confident you are. And obviously there must be no problem with this chamor. Eini minasehu me'ata. I'm not going to test. I don't need to test it out from this moment now that I see how certain you are that it's good. Afani hodesi lidivrechem. So Moshe says, so too I conceded to you, Bnei Yisrael, when you said, let us send spies. I didn't want to say no, because then you might say, oh, there must be a problem. There must be things Moshe doesn't want us to know about. So I said, yes. I said, sure, no problem. shematachseru bachem kishetiru she'eni ma'akev. Once you would see that I didn't hold anything back, I assumed you would say, okay, we don't have to send them a raglim because Moshe, we see you have nothing to hide. You're being transparent. Va'atem lo chazartem bachem. And you did not retract your request. And so in the end, the meraglim were sent. And of course, we know what transpired after that. So that Rashi, the Zera Shimshon, is going to refer to, and it's going to become a critical Rashi in this piece in the Zera Shimshon. But as he often does, he assumes we know the Rashi, so he just mentions kind of a little excerpt from it. So, but it's important for us to see the whole Rashi in order to understand what the Zera Shimshon wants to do, the ideas that he wants to develop here. So now let us look, with that preface, let us take a look at the Zera Shimshon Ostal. Vayitav be'enai hadavar. This is the quote from the pasuk that we just read. Moshe said, "It was good in my eyes." Pirish Rashi. Rashi explains, and of course this is the Rashi that we just read, or it's a piece from it. Ve'im be'enei Moshe hayatov lama amr b'sochachos. And if in the eyes of Moshe this was a good idea to send the meraglim, why is he mentioning the request of the Bnei Yisrael to send meraglim as a rebuke? Mashal la'adam, it's similar to a man, similar to a man who says to his friend, sell me your donkey, Amar Lohain, and he says yes. This is, of course, the Rashi we read. Nasno atal lila nisayon, will you let me take it out for a test? Amar Lohain, he said yes, v'chule, etc. So the Zera Shimshon leaves off there and doesn't quote the rest of the Rashi. Oh, he jumps to the end of the Rashi, as we're going to see here. Afani hodesi lidivrechem. So too Moshe concluded, I admitted, I agree that we could send meraglim shema tachseru bachem. Once, hopefully, because you would then see that you don't need to send meraglim, since I already said yes. Because you would see that I wasn't holding anything back. Va'atem lo chazartem bachem. But you did not retract your desire to send the meraglim ad kan lashono. Until here are the excerpts from the Rashi. So now the Zera Shimshon continues in the second paragraph. Koshe, this is difficult. Because this is difficult. Why? Because even according to this explanation, lo shayach lomar vayitav be'enai hadavar. It's not really precise to say, for Moshe to say, it was good in my eyes. The yoser tov hayishalo yishalu klum. It would have been better, according to Rashi's explanation. Moshe still would have liked it better had they not asked anything. In other words, Moshe was responding to the fact that they asked to send meraglim, and he thought he had a plan. He thought he had a strategy that would help them see that he wasn't worried about sending meraglim, and therefore they wouldn't send meraglim. But the ideal situation would have been that they not ask at all, as the Zera Shimshon continues. Ella ya'aminu b'hakadosh baruch hu u'b'Moshe. But rather they should have trusted in Hashem and Moshe, and therefore they never would have asked to send meraglim. And that would have been the best thing. That would have been the true vayitav be'enai, the thing that Moshe would have really liked to see happen. Umidika Omar vayitav be'enai hadavar, from the fact that the Torah, that Moshe says this thing was good in my eyes, nireh shahayatov be'enai Moshe sheyish'alu davar zeh. That Moshe was actually making a tremendous concession here. He was saying, no, it was actually good. I was happy that you asked to do this. Moshe wanted them to make this request so that he could respond the way that he did. And then they could see, okay, fine, we don't need to actually send them a meraglim because we see that Moshe is so being so upfront and so transparent. Yoser mishaim ha'aminu b'tchila, and this would have even been better to Moshe and Moshe's way of thinking than if they had complete emunah below she'ela klal, without any request to send meraglim. V'zeh eino lefi terutzo shel Rashi, and this that we just explained doesn't align fully with the teretz of Rashi, with the explanation and the answer to the question of Rashi zichrono livracha. So let's pause here to make sure we understand what's happening. In the pasuk, in the beginning of Devarim, Moshe is recounting everything, various incidents that had happened, and he recounts the incident of the meraglim again in very short form. And he says, "Vayitov be'enai hadaber." This was a good thing in my eyes. And Rashi asked, if it was a good thing in Moshe's eyes, why is it part of tochachos? Why is it part of things that Moshe is mentioning that are supposed to be critical of Bnei Yisrael? And Rashi answers, because Moshe had a strategy that Bnei Yisrael would be okay once they made this request. If he said fine, then everything would be okay. And the Zera Shimshon says, we understand that, and we get where Rashi's coming from, so to speak, but the words are problematic. Vayitav be'enai hadavar. When Moshe says, the fact that you asked to send Meraglim was good to me, Moshe says, then it has to be something more. There has to be more than just what Rashi explained, because it seems to be clearly from the Lashon, it seems to be Moshe was saying, I am actually glad you made a request. Don't think I would have preferred that you not make this request. I'm glad you made this request to send Meraglim. And that we don't have an explanation from in the Rashi that we read. So that's where the Zera Shimshon's question comes in. How do we fully understand the words that Moshe said, Vayitav be'enai hadavar, this matter, this request was good in my eyes. So the Zera Shimshon continues. V'od yesh ledakdek, and there is more to analyze B'mesha Amar Moshe l'meraglim, and what Moshe said to the spies. Okay, well, what the words that Moshe, the instructions that Moshe gave to the meraglim back in Bamidbar, when the actual Maisa of the meraglim is recounted. What did he say? Uri'isem esa'aretz, you should see the land, v'chulei, etc. Hechazak hu harofeh, is it strong or is it weak? Ma'atu is talking about the people. Are they strong or are they weak? Are they few or are they many? And there's a list of other points that Moshe mentions over there for the Meraglim to check out. What need was there for Moshe to specifically clarify these issues and say, these are the things I want you to check out and report back about? V'halohem dvarim pshutim. They seem to be obvious matters, obvious issues. Anyone who was sent on this kind of mission would pay attention to these things. So the Zera Shimshon saying the specific details, the specific instructions that Moshe gave the Meraglim back in Parsha Shlach seem a little strange because they seem obvious. He should not have needed to clarify and spell out these specific issues in such detail. V'hayadai lomar bistam, and it should have been sufficient for Moshe to say simply, plainly, uri'isem esa aretz mahi ve'esa ama yoshev aleha. Go see the land and check it out and see the people and that live there. That's it. And they would have understood they would have understood without Moshe specifically asking the questions that he did, that those were the kinds of things that they should explore. Visulo, and Moshe shouldn't have needed to say anything else. So the Zera Shimshon here, what he's doing and what he is in line with what he often does before beginning to answer a question, he often adds other questions, you might say, other things to think about that help move us in the direction of an explanation and of an answer. So let's continue. Omnam, however, Isa b'Shulchan Aruch Choshen Mishpat, it is stated in the Shulchan Aruch and Choshen Mishpat, Kol shehiskimu alav b'nei Medina, shehu mum shemachzirin bo hamekach zemachzirin. If you are making a business transaction, a buyer and a seller are working on a transaction, on a deal, then any kind of flaw in the thing being sold, the item or the property being sold, any kind of flaw that becomes present, if this is a flaw that it is customary for people in that area to view as a problem and something that would nullify the sale, then the sale is nullified, okay? And continuing in Shulchan Aruch, v'chol she'eskimu alav she'eino mum, and anything that people in this area agree is not a significant flaw, it's not enough of a serious problem to nullify the sale, hareza eino machzir bo, then the sale is not nullified, and the buyer and seller have to keep the deal. Ela im piresh, unless one of them explained and explicitly said, address this issue of the particular problem. Why is this the rule? Shulchan Aruch continues, shekol hanosei v'nosein stam, anyone who does business, two people who do business plainly without spelling out and clarifying specific concerns or problems, potential issues, al minhag medina hu somech, he is relying on the minhag medina, the way that people in this area handle these sales and these types of transactions. Ad kan lishono, until here is a quote from the Shulchan Aruch Choshen Mishpat. Good. So that's a piece of halacha that the Zera Shimshon is now putting in as a building block to begin developing his approach to the questions that he's posed. The im kain, and if so, nira she Yisrael holchu etzel Moshe lishloach hamaraglim. It would appear then that we can fill in some missing pieces by saying that Bnei Yisrael came to Moshe and they said, we want to send maraglim. They made a request to send maraglim, to send these spies. V'hiskimu beinehem al inyan hamumin sheyimtzeu ba. And they had a conversation and they reached an agreement about the kinds of flaws that could be found in Eretz Yisrael and be okay, and the kinds of flaws that might be found, and then that would make the arrangement, the transaction, not okay. So even though this is not spelled out in the Chumash that this conversation took place, as Zera Shimshon is saying, we understand from the way Shulchan Aruch discusses the halacha, and we understand from the questions that we've asked that there was some unusual things going on, that this must have taken place. This kind of conversation about possible potential flaws in Eretz Yisrael and what the Meraglim might find there, that kind of conversation took place between Moshe Rabbeinu and Bnei Yisrael. Dahainu, and this refers to, Im yesham harov am, if there will be in the land a tremendous, multitudinous amount of people. That was one issue. Im yiyu chazakim, and if they would be very powerful people, dahainu sheyeshvu b'prazim, and this would mean that they lived in open cities, not fortified cities. Shehu hasimon shemasar lahem lirois imhu chazak, because this was the sign that Moshe Rabbeinu told the Bnei Yisrael would tell them whether or not the people were strong or weak, meaning if the people lived in fortified cities, this means that this would indicate that they were not so strong themselves. They were not such mighty, powerful warriors themselves, and that's why they used fortifications to protect themselves. But if they lived in open cities and open towns, that would mean that they relied on their own martial qualities and their own fighting abilities, and that they were actually very strong people. Moshe Pirish Rashi for Parsha Shlach Lecha, as Rashi explains again back in Parsha Shlach on the when it discusses, when Moshe talks about the point, the issue of strong fortified cities versus open towns. The Odiyah Nikra Mum, and also furthermore it would be considered a flaw, a blemish, Im Haaretz Tiyeh Razeh, if the land would be exiguous, it would be without much produce, without much vegetation. Or if you didn't see trees there that grew there, that would also be a flaw, and that they would agree would be problematic. And because of this, meaning because Moshe and the people Bnei Yisrael had this conversation about flaws, possible flaws in the land that the Meraglim would find, and which one of the flaws would be significant and which one of the flaws would be insignificant. That's why Moshe spelled out all of these details about that are mentioned back in Shlach. Told the Meraglim, check and see is the land or the city's going to be strong or weak, etc. In order to make known to them this whole subject of the flaws that were agreed upon between Moshe and representatives of Bnei Yisrael, whichever people of Bnei Yisrael, whichever ones of the people had the conversation with Moshe about the flaws. So here again, let's pause. The Zera Shimshon is theorizing, is suggesting that a conversation which is never spelled out explicitly, which is never described openly in the Torah, the Zera Shimshon is saying it seems that this conversation must have taken place based on the other things that we've discussed, meaning why did Moshe talk about these details and the inyan of the psak and the Shulchan Aruch about the fact that these kinds of things have to be agreed upon between the buyer and a seller when you make a transaction, and if not, if things aren't specified, then they follow the minhag hamakom and the way that those things are going. So Zera Shimshon says this kind of conversation must have taken place, and they came to an agreement about which kinds of flaws would be acceptable to everyone and which kinds of flaws would be really, really seriously problematic. Zera Shimshon continues, Vizehu shekosav, in this now that we understand this, we can understand the phrase that that the Zera Shimshon wants to explain to us. Zehu shekosav vayitav be'enai hadavar. This is why the pasuk said, and that Moshe quotes Moshe as saying, and this was good in my eyes. Shahayatov be'enai. Moshe was saying, it is good in my eyes, lahaskim beinenu hamumin, that we should have a conversation about agreeing upon the flaws, the possible flaws that the Meraglim might find. Lefisha hayisi yodeya, because Moshe says, I know, shebe'eretz Yisrael lo hayashumum me'osam shehis kamnu. I know that Eretz Yisrael doesn't suffer from any of the flaws that we agreed upon. Okay, so Moshe says, that's why it was good in my eyes. What was good in my eyes? That you made this request to sin Meraglim, which opened the door for me to discuss what is it the Meraglim are going to see that might concern you. And you could tell me about the flaws that might be problematic if the Meraglim came back and reported them, and we could discuss that and come to a hesking. We could come to an agreement, as according to the halach and the Shulchan Aruch, we could come to an agreement as to which flaws would be significant and which flaws would not be problematic at all. And that's what Moshe said was good. That was a good thing to have in place. Ubozeh dayik shapir terutzo shel Rashi. And here the language of Rashi in his explanation was very precise. It fits in exactly with what we're saying. Beharim ugevos, in the mushal that Rashi gave, the man who wanted to buy the donkey said, can I take it for a test drive? Yes. Can I take it up into the mountains and the hills? Amar lohain. And the man said to him, yes. No, and so I can test it and take it anywhere. Amar lohain. And the guy said, yes. So the Zera Shimshon says, this example that Rashi gave, where do we find that Bnei Yisrael and Moshe had anything like a remotely similar conversation to the parable, to the fictional conversation between the guy who wants to buy a donkey and the man who wants to sell a donkey? Where do we see that? Elavadai shemima sheparat Moshe hechezaku harafehu v'chulei. But definitely the Zera Shimshon says this language of Rashi confirms the fact that when Moshe spelled out, again, this was back in Parsha Shlach, when Moshe spelled out a series of questions and things that the spies should specifically look into and explore, Anu lemeidim, we can learn from that, hadiburim shahayu beinehem, the conversations that must have taken place between Moshe and the people about this subject. V'im lo hayu maskimim bazeh. And if they had not come to an agreement about this, let's imagine the people had never asked about Meraglim. And because they never asked about Meraglim, they never had any kind of conversation with Moshe about flaws and things that the Meraglim might find. If that had never happened, Hayachoshesh Moshe pen yomru, then Moshe was concerned that at some future point the people might say, Sha'af ma she'eno mum shehu mum, that some problem that they might encounter when they came into the land, even though it's not, shouldn't be considered a serious problem, the people might say, oh, look, this is terrible, a terrible flaw, a terrible problem. But now that Moshe had reached an agreement and the people agreed to it, they have no opening in which to say that there are problems. So the Zera Shimshon has now answered his starting question. What did it mean, Vayitav be'enai hadavar? What did Moshe mean when he said, this was good in my eyes? So again, Rashi explained it the way Rashi explained it. And there's Zera Shimshon says we need to add to that and deepen our understanding of those words. And the deeper understanding, according to the Zera Shimshon that he's provided us with, is that Moshe was saying, I actually wanted this conversation to take place. The fact that the people came and said, let's send Meraglim, opened up a channel of communication that Moshe says I felt was very important and very necessary. And that enabled us to discuss potential and possible problems with the land. And had we not had that conversation, then who knows what might have resulted. Perhaps the people would have started to come into the land. And right when they crossed over the Yarden, they would have said, this is a problem, that's a problem, because the subject was never discussed. They could then say, we don't want the whole thing. We don't want to go in, Chas v'shalom, we don't want to go into Eretz Yisrael. But now Moshe said, now that we discussed it and worked everything out, Moshe's totally confident. I know there's no problem. Why? Because as the Zera Shimshon already explained, the types of flaws that were agreed upon were issues that Moshe felt were not problematic in the land. They were not real issues, and he felt like the Meraglim would not come back and give any kind of report about those specific issues that were agreed upon being present and being problematic. That was Moshe's assumption. So Moshe felt good about the situation when the Meraglim were about to leave. Ubederach zeh yuvan nami mashe pirush Rashi. And along with this idea that we've developed, we can now understand what Rashi explains on a different pasuk. Al pasuk vayashivu osanu davar. This is also, one of the psukim that we read in the beginning, where Moshe says, we're going to send people and they're going to bring us back davar, literally a word. They will bring us back a word. So Rashi says, what did it mean that Meraglim will bring back davar, a word? Be'eze loshon hein midabrim. Rashi says this means the spies, one of the things they would report on would be which language the people and the land spoke. They would come back and literally bring back a word, meaning come back and report on the words and the language that the people spoke. Why would it make any difference to Bnei Yisrael to know what language or languages the people in Eretz Canaan spoke? But because they agreed, Moshe and the people agreed that the issue of language and the languages that the people spoke could be a problem, that's why Moshe told the Meraglim to report about that point. In other words, this Zera Shimshon saying Moshe went to the nth degree to clarify before the Meraglim left exactly what would be valid issues and concerns and how they would be discussed and handled, and which subjects and matters would not be valid problems. So now the Zera Shimshon explains what happened with Moshe's confidence and why his trust was broken. With all of the effort that Moshe went into putting in to coming to an agreement and an arrangement and understanding with the people beforehand, none of that helped. Because when the spies came back, they spoke Lashon Hara, they gave false reports. And they said, they brought up flaws that were never agreed upon, that had not been discussed and agreed upon by Moshe and the people. For example, Kishem Shapirya Mishuna Kach Amo Mishuna. They brought back this fruit that was bizarrely large, huge, as the Torah tells us. They brought back a grape cluster that was so big that you had to carry it. 4 men had to carry it. The 2 men, had to carry it on staffs between their shoulders. The 1 man couldn't just bring back a bunch of grapes. So the Meraglim said, you see, they have this crazy fruit and it's bizarre, strange fruit, and that shows us that the people in Eretz Canaan are strong and also must be of huge proportions, and they use that to bring back a false report. And another example is, even though the Meraglim saw that the people lived in fortified cities, and this was specifically addressed beforehand by Moshe when he said, if you see they live in fortified cities, this tells you that they are weak people, they're not strong people, and just the opposite would be true. If they live in unfortified open cities, then that would be viewed as a sign of the people's strength. Nonetheless, the Meraglim came back and they talked about the fortified cities and frightened the people into talking and into saying this meant that the inhabitants of Eretz Canaan were mighty warriors. Im kol zeh amru ki chazaku mimenu, and the Meraglim concluded, putting aside all the agreements with Moshe beforehand, that the people are too strong for us. We can't possibly conquer them. Ulefikach, and therefore, amra bisochachos, and therefore Moshe included this incident of the Meraglim that he had agreed to, and this conversation that he had embraced, Nonetheless, because of the way it turned out and because of the false reporting and interpretations of the Meraglim, he included it in the Sochachos, saying to the people, look, think back to everything we agreed upon and everything we discussed, and then recall how the Meraglim came back and twisted everything. And instead of rejecting their report, instead of saying to the Meraglim, instead of the people saying to the Meraglim, no, this, we talked about this with Moshe Rabbeinu beforehand. You're bringing in things that are not relevant, or you're twisting the significance of things, and you're talking about that goes against our agreement. Talking about things that goes against our agreement. The people accepted it, and they cried in their tents. And of course, we know the consequences that happened, that the Torah describes, and the consequences for the future of Klal Yisrael and Bnei Yisrael. So as we look back on this piece, again, we see several characteristic pieces of development that we've seen so many times in their Zera Shimshon. First of all, how he takes different sources and uses them together to develop a theme to then go back and answer his original questions, and also the bringing in of Shulchan Aruch, of Halacha, to show how when we learn Chumash and we learn Psukim in the Torah, we should never separate that in our mind from learning Halacha. Why? Because the Zera Shimshon is teaching us that the people in Chumash, the people that were reading the stories about the Torah, followed halacha, and if they followed halacha, that helps us understand. The study of halacha helps us understand conversations that they had and actions that they took, which this is a clear example of. Yasher koach to everyone for participating, and Yetz Hashem, I look forward to learning together with everyone again next week.